Hi everyone, I'm Dimitri Farber from Manhattan Prep. I'm here in my hometown of San Diego, where I teach GMAT, GRE, and LSAT. I also teach online. And I'm here today to talk to you about the differences between the GMAT and GRE, both in terms of the test content and in terms of what they mean for you as an applicant. So hello everybody and welcome, and we'll get going. Before we start, I want to mention that GMAT Club has a giveaway attached to this event. So they're giving away 10 GMAT Club tests as a subscription. To win one, just make sure to like the video and post a comment once live stream is over, and you can look at the event description for more details. All right. And here we go. Okay. So let's talk GMAT versus GRE. I'm guessing some of you have taken the GMAT before, or perhaps the GRE as well. So some of this may be familiar to you, but we'll look at how those two differ, and a lot of what they have in common. There's a lot of similarities between the two. So some basics about the GMAT exam. Your exam is good for up to 5 years. So some people choose to take the test shortly out of college or at any other time when they're feeling, well prepared, even though they might be planning to work for a few years before applying to business school. Costs $250 to register. It's administered 6 days a week, all year round. You can take it as often as every 16 days, not recommending that, but that's how long you have to wait. There is a maximum of 5 times a year. It might sound like a crazy thing to stress, since who wants to take the GMAT 5 times? But I have had students come up against that limit. And one reason that you don't want to switch from GMAT to GRE is that you've maxed out your GMAT administrations for the year and have no choice but to take another test. So definitely make sure that you're going into a test because you know you can do better, or at least suspect strongly that you can do better, not because you just would like to do better. That's very important. The average GMAT score is around 547 worldwide. Most of the top schools are looking at 700 plus. A lot of my students are targeting a score around 700, 720, although that is a median. And so even very selective schools, such as Booth or Harvard or things like that, will end up taking some students with much lower scores than that if they like their application. On the flip side of that, if you have an 800, that's not going to force any school to accept you. No school will if there's other things about your application that they don't like. Some things about the test. One thing that's really important for people to get used to about the GMAT is that there are no supports. There's no calculator. There's no spell checker. You can't have your phone. In fact, I've had a student get kicked out of the GMAT for glancing at their phone during the break. So it's very strict about it. I sometimes joke that you have to take the test in a hospital gown. It's not quite there yet, but it's pretty close. You get your results immediately for everything but your essay, which is scored by one human and one computer. You can decide whether or not you want to cancel the score. You can even cancel or reinstate scores retroactively. However, for the most part, schools are only interested in your highest reported score anyway. So if you took the test 4 times and didn't cancel any of the scores, typically schools won't care about those low scores. They want to report those high numbers as their median GMAT scores for admitted students. Okay. And okay, we'll go from there. You can register at mba.com for the GMAT. It's $250 per test, like I said. As far as the structure of the test goes, it's broken down into several pieces. There is a section for an essay at the beginning. This essay is basically you're taking one argument similar to what you'll see in critical reasoning on the test. We'll get to in a minute, and breaking that down. This is scored on a 0 to 6 scale. Most students do fairly well in this test, on this part of the test. If you struggle with written expression or with English as a language, you may have some trouble there, but it's not the major concern on the test for sure for most people. And most importantly, it's not part of your 200 to 800 reported score. Okay, it's a separately reported score. There's an integrated reasoning section, which is pretty tough. A lot of people find that section is not at all easy. However, it is also a separate score. It's scored on a scale of 1 to 8. Okay. In some ways, the integrated reasoning is the part of the GMAT that's closest to some of the newer features of the GRE, where there are answers with where questions with multiple potential answers, multi-part, and you have to get all the parts correct to get the question correct. After a brief break, you get a quantitative section. That's 75 minutes. It's broken into two types: problem solving and data sufficiency. Problem solving is your basic A through E multiple choice. That will be the majority of our questions, and then you also get quite a few data sufficiency questions, which are a little bit more meta or abstract in that you have to determine how much information you need in order to solve a problem. The equivalent to that on the GRE would be the quantitative comparison. Those have some things in common, as we'll talk about. After your second break, which is technically optional, but you really ought to take, you have your 75-minute verbal section. Verbal covers 3 topics. Sentence correction is basically grammar. Which of these ways would be the best way to say a sentence? Critical reasoning, which is logical argumentation. How would you strengthen or weaken this argument? What could you infer? And reading comprehension, which is probably the most familiar if you've taken any standardized test. You're reading a passage and you're answering a few questions about it. Usually the passage is in the neighborhood of 2 to 4 paragraphs, and then you're answering some questions on that. Together, it's almost a 4-hour experience. Your 2 scores, quant and verbal, combined to give you a 200-800 score. But it's not a simple mathematics of, multiply each score by 4 and add them together or anything like that. It's actually the raw score underlying them that makes your score. That's important for a couple of reasons. One, 2 people with the same scores could actually have a different total score. For instance, one of my colleagues, I'm sure you won't feel very sorry for him, but one of my colleagues got a 51 quant, 51 verbal, so perfect scores in both sections, and got a 790 rather than an 800. Again, not a major tragedy, but it just shows that you can get, even with some variation in score, you can get different results because the raw score that underlies that is basically being rounded, would be one way to think of it. In terms of content, the quant section is often very challenging for people, even if they have a math background. I often find myself tutoring people who are math majors, engineers, etc. Not because the math is so advanced at all. There's no trigonometry, there's no calculus, there's very minimal statistics, but that the way it's presented is very tricky, and you have to think about things differently. Sometimes it's a matter of backing away from solving a problem outright and saying, what answer would make sense? Where do these numbers seem to be going? Maybe I can't easily solve an equation here, but can I get a sense of what the number ought to be? And that can be off-putting for people who are used to setting up and solving equations all the time. On the verbal side, that's many people's greatest challenge, so much so that the percentiles on the GMAT are very skewed. For instance, let's say that you got a 45 quant and a 45 verbal. Generally speaking, that would mean you were scoring around a 720 on the GMAT, an excellent score. But what's interesting is that a 45 verbal would be the 99th percentile, meaning that you scored in the top 1%. You scored higher than 99% of test takers. But if you get a 45 quant, that only puts you at the 63rd percentile. You scored, better than just under 2/3 of test takers. Still great, but nowhere near the 99th percentile. In fact, a 99th percentile on GMAT quant doesn't exist. Even if you get a 51 quant, which is amazing, you'll be at the 97th percentile last we checked. And that's because of who's taking the test. The people who take this test tend to be very strong at quant. And not very many people who are taking this test are, poets or journalists or English teachers or anything like that would be more likely to be comfortable with the verbal side. However, often we will find that students have equal room to grow in both. So as long as your 0 or your 1 to 51 score is roughly similar on both sections, or another way to say it, as long as you're not near 51 on either section, you're usually best off spending equal time on both rather than worrying about the percentiles. And even if you're doing much better at one than the other, it's important not to maybe go more than 2 to 1 in your emphasis on one topic. Okay. Quick question about GMAT scoring. What do you think is going to happen to these 2 students? Who's going to get a higher score? If you look at the blue, marks as correct questions, and the red marks as incorrect questions, then you have to think, all right, well, clearly this this first student is getting some very difficult questions correct. Seems like they would be scoring higher. The second student is not reaching those peaks, but doesn't drop quite as low at the end. Who does better? Well, you may have guessed that it's student 2. Okay, student 2 does better because they end up better. And it's not that the last question you get is the determinant of your score. It's more about the overall arc or the overall performance of your test. But I think of student 1 as sort of like you see those cautionary tales of someone who reached great riches in life and then you know, fell from grace. And you don't want to do that. This person ended up missing some very easy questions because they didn't have time to finish strong. It's much better to sort of get rich slow, as you'd say, and gradually improve your score. Okay. So the GMAT is a question adaptive test, which means that every time you get a question right or wrong, that affects what the next question you see is going to be. And it's very important to get used to that if you're going to take the GMAT. It's typical to miss a very large percent of the questions. It could be around 40%, even if you're doing very well. I have people scoring in the 700s who are still missing a third to 40% of the questions. And so if you're a perfectionist who can't get anything wrong, it can be very frustrating to get used to the GMAT and realize that you can't think that way. Okay. So basics about the GRE. First off, your score is also good for 5 years. It's a little cheaper, $205. It's no bargain perhaps, but a little cheaper. GRE is also often offered 6 days a week at test centers. Some centers actually don't offer a weekend test, and some test centers even offer Sunday tests. There's a slightly longer waiting period of 21 days. Your verbal and quant scores are both scored separately, so they're on a scale of 130 to 170. And so it's a little bit different to get used to if you're used to the 200 to 800 scoring of GMAT or something like SAT. GRE is a very common test, and it's taken for many other things than business school, right? People take GRE tests to go into psychology or education or things like that, right? For that reason, the quant percentiles aren't driven up or driven down, I suppose I should say, in that crazy fashion that they are on the GMAT. But that doesn't mean that your performance will necessarily be any stronger when you take the GRE. It's just what the percentiles say. You also, on the GRE, don't have a spell checker, and you don't have your phone, of course. You do have an on-screen calculator, which means that the questions are designed to foil the calculator. There aren't generally very many questions on the GRE that you can simply punch in on a calculator and get the answer to. On the GMAT, although that's certainly not the main thing they're testing, you know, just simple arithmetic, that might be part of the challenge. The GRE will find ways to get around that, either by giving you things that you have to think about more abstractly, or by giving you values that are too big for your calculator, and you have to think about what would make sense. How do I know that this large exponential term is bigger or smaller than this other large exponential term? You get your score immediately on the GRE, again, except for the essay. On the GMAT, you can choose to cancel your score. This doesn't happen on the GRE. Instead, what you can do is you can decide which scores to send to schools. When you send your scores to business schools, they're basically just getting a code that allows them to access all of your scores. And so they'll see anything but a canceled score, which won't even show up as you haven't taken it at all, unlike in the past where they'd see a cancellation. On the GRE, they'll simply only see the scores that you select to send. You can't mix and match, though. An individual school, if you set several scores, an individual school could choose to look at your best quant and your best verbal, but you can't simply say, oh, I want to send my 165 quant and I want to send my 167 verbal from 2 different tests. Okay, and you register for that with ETS, right? So the ETS is who does the GRE, GMAC is who does the GMAT, and their website is mba.com. Okay. Structure of the GRE is similar in some ways. You start with an essay, although here you actually have two. One's analysis of an argument, just like on the GMAT. One's analysis of an issue, which is a little different in that you're actually bringing in some real world knowledge on this one. They'll ask you for an issue, and you'll have to give your opinion on this issue and support it with ideas from the real world. So that's a little bit different. But the scoring is similar. You're getting a 0 to 6 score. And similarly, you should do fairly well if you're comfortable with writing a standard sort of 5-paragraph essay format in English. The content of the GRE in some ways is very, very similar. If you look at the quant, the range of what's tested is nearly, although not exactly, identical. Again, it's testing mostly algebra, some geometry, lots of word problems, some elementary stats, no trigonometry, no calculus, etc. The difference in the GRE Quant is that instead of data sufficiency, which is asking how much information do you need, you have quantitative comparison, which is asking you to compare two columns and say which one is bigger. The twist is that there's a possibility that they're equal or that it can't be determined, and that's a valid possibility every time. And so you have to get good at testing different things. Oh, what if I make x 5? What if I make x a negative fraction? What if I make x 0? Well, that changed the value of this column relative to the other one. So it's some of the same kind of thinking you have to do in data sufficiency if you're familiar with that format, but a little bit different process. And for me, as a long-term GMAT teacher and taker, the frustrating thing for me on GRE is that I actually have to find the answer. On GMAT data sufficiency, I just have to say whether I can find the answer. On the GRE, they want to say, no, which one is it? Is it column A that's bigger or column B? The other difference with GRE Quant is that there's some other format differences. For instance, data interpretation will give you a chart or table or graph for you to interpret with multiple questions asking you to relate pieces of that graph. It's similar to what you'll see in integrated reasoning on the GMAT, but here it's incorporated right into your main scored section. You'll also see some different question formats where you have to select more than one answer. And that's a little bit different from the GMAT, where there's always exactly one answer except in integrated reasoning. On the verbal section, you will also have reading comprehension. Reading comprehension is very similar, although on the GRE, the passages are often a bit shorter and have fewer questions, at least some of the time. They also mix together what we call critical reasoning on the GMAT into reading comprehension. So there won't be as much of that. So if you hate critical reasoning, there's a little less of it on the GRE, but it's mixed right in with reading comp, and then those tasks are often sort of blurred, right? You might have a reading comprehension passage and then suddenly you say, hey, how would you strengthen this argument? The other big difference in verbal that people frequently tout is the switch from grammar to vocabulary. Both text completion and sentence equivalence are formats that test what words would go in this sentence best. And that requires you to know the words. And so what people commonly say is that the GRE is testing vocabulary while the GMAT is testing grammar. The problem with that, although it's true, is that what the vocabulary questions are really also testing is reading comprehension still, sentence structure. When I'm teaching the GRE, I spend much more time talking about how to read the sentences and understand what should go in those blanks, right? You're filling in blanks in a sentence. Then I spend working on drilling vocabulary. That's partly because it's very difficult to drill vocabulary as a teacher. That's something the students need to do on their own. But it's also because much of the time, students are missing problems not based on words they don't know, but based on their misread of the sentence or their inattention to cues. And so you can actually get much, much better at GRE verbal without learning a single new word. And that's really important to keep in mind when you're weighing the difference between these two tests. And if you try these tests out and determine, oh, I like this one better or that one better, it's something to think about in terms of how you improve. Yes, you want to learn some vocabulary, but if I learn some new word like, concupiscent or something like that, is that going to show up on the GRE? Honestly, probably not. Any one given word, just like memorizing an idiom on the GMAT, you may not see that idiom again. But recognizing the process you need to do to get the question right is incredibly valuable. Okay. There's also another difference in scoring between the GMAT and GRE, which is that the GMAT is question adaptive. It's changing with every question. The GRE is section adaptive, which means you get a section that's the same as what someone else might get, and then you get a different second section depending on how you do. There's also an unscored section. You won't know which one it is. On the GMAT, those unscored questions are built into your section again. So on the GMAT, if I'm doing a 37 question quant section, some of those questions, perhaps even a quarter of them, just simply won't count toward my score, and I won't know which ones they are. It's a good reason not to spend too much time on any one question. On the GRE, I'll have a whole section like that, and at the end, I'll say, oh, I had 3 quant sections. One of those must have been experimental, or oh, I had 3 verbal sections, but I won't know. There may also be a research section. They'll actually disclose to you that that's not scored, and they're basically just using you to test out some future stuff that's a little less like the rest of the test, perhaps. But we don't care much about that. We would just do it to be nice and move on with our day. Okay. As far as putting your score together, the way the GRE does it is they look at, okay, how'd you do on the first section? Should we route you into a harder section, a medium section, or an easy section? And it's important to notice these overlapping areas. So if I really do poorly on that first quant section, and I'm given an easy second quant section, it's possible to redeem myself and score the same as someone who got a harder second section and didn't do as well. Similarly, if I get the best section, the hardest section, and I don't do well there, I might not score any better than someone who's rounded to the medium one. So it's less important to try to guarantee that you get into the correct section, although obviously you want to do as well as you can, than it is to make sure your performance is really consistent. Another interesting difference from the GRE, this isn't officially disclosed, but as far as we know, there's no difference from one question to the next. In other words, if I get a hard question right, that's not any more valuable to me than getting an easy question right. It's just about the section. So it's important to use your time wisely in that regard. And although that's certainly not true on the GMAT, you want to make sure that you don't miss the easy questions, and it's okay to miss the harder ones. The same reasoning finally holds on both, which is that you want to avoid wasting time on problems that aren't going well for you, and spend that time more productively on questions that you know you can do. The way you handle that is different on the GMAT. You have to move on and guess, right? If you see a question and you just don't think you can do it, you can't come back to it because the test changes as you go. It's like it would be like traveling back in time. So you have to just guess your favorite letter or narrow it down as much as you can and guess. And that's actually really smart to do. On the GRE, you can skip a question and come back to it. That's good in some ways because it gives you some flexibility. It's bad in others if you find yourself doing that a lot and coming back to questions and looking at them repeatedly and then not using your time efficiently. It can also be bad if you then don't go back and fill in answers to those. So it's usually a good idea to, even if you're skipping a question, fill in an answer just so that you don't leave anything unmarked at the end in case you run out of time. So I want to answer some commonly asked questions about the differences between these two tests, and then I'll open it up for Q&A at the end of the session as well. So first off, a lot of people, if they're applying to business schools, want to know, can I use this to get into schools? These days, most schools are taking the GRE, and that includes a lot of the top schools. And some people say, okay, but are they really taking it, or are they just saying they're taking it? And no, they're pretty serious about it. What AdCom told us is basically, look, we wouldn't take the GRE if we weren't going to treat people fairly who take it. So it's a real way to get into business school. There are schools that do not accept the GRE at all, and there are other schools that make clear that they have a preference for the GMAT over the GRE, and that's really important to consider, right? If a school you're applying to won't take the GRE, then you'd have to either take both tests or waive going to that school, and that's an important thing to think about as you're going forward. Okay, so again, some prefer the GMAT, but they generally say that they are going to take both tests, treat both tests equally. Okay, some people feel that the GRE is easier and that's going to give them an edge, and I find that that's mostly a myth. It is true that if you're really good, for instance, at the quant that's tested on these two tests, you'll probably find the GRE easier. I certainly find it easier. When I go into the GMAT, there'll still be some problem that I struggle with. If I think back to the last time I took the GMAT, there are a couple that I'm confident that I got wrong in retrospect. On the GRE, I'm not sure I missed any. It was a little bit more comfortable of a test. It was a little easier to max out my score on that test, given my high degree of comfort with the quant. If you're not quite that comfortable, it might not make a difference. But the other thing is that the scores are going to often be equivalent. And if you just quickly Google GRE GMAT conversion, you can see a commonly used tool for doing that. And you'll find that often it'll come out to about the same. I had one student who was very frustrated with the GMAT and switched over to the GRE and got exactly the equivalent score. And that's pretty common, that although you might feel better about certain content, the actual result is not that different. So there are some reasons to switch, which we can talk about, but you wouldn't want to do that too quickly. If you're applying for a dual degree, that may involve applying to a program that takes the GRE, or that requires the GRE. And if that's the case, then it really makes sense to take the GRE and not the GMAT, right? Sometimes you have no choice. For instance, if you're doing a JD MBA, you have to take the GMAT and the LSAT, for instance. But if you can take the GRE to get you into both, and you can't use the GMAT to get into both, then that makes the decision for you, right? As I said, GMAT is not necessarily harder than the GRE, although it can feel harder. There are some definite differences. The GMAT's a little heavier on what you might call story problems, word problems, than the GRE, although they certainly exist in both tests. There's more logic being tested in the math. The GRE is more about watching those tricky formats, but it's also dealing with there's quite a bit of logic involved in the data interpretation. And so if you don't like, for instance, the integrated reasoning section of the GMAT, you might find the format of the GRE off-putting. The GRE stresses geometry a little more. I've also found that it stretches into stats a little bit more than the GMAT does. Again, not much. You don't know how to calculate. You don't have to know, for instance, how to calculate a standard deviation, but it just extends a little bit more. I've seen references to things like interquartile range that would never show up on the GMAT. The other frequently touted difference is that, as I said, the difference between testing grammar and testing vocab, although both are really also testing comprehension. When you're doing GMAT sentence correction, you have to make sure that the sentence makes sense, not just that it follows grammatical rules. And when you're doing GRE text completion and sentence equivalence, you have to make sure you're understanding the sentence well enough to fill in a good answer. The other thing that I often push people on is, are they really better off switching to something new? Is that really the problem? I think about it, let's say you were trying to learn the guitar and you were frustrated and you just weren't making progress. Would it be a good idea, if you'd been spending some time learning the guitar, to switch to learn the piano or the saxophone? Well, it partly depends on why you're having trouble. If your trouble is something that's unique to the guitar, maybe you have small hands and you can't hold the guitar comfortably or reach across the frets, or maybe your fingertips are very sensitive and you don't like pressing on the strings, or maybe you just hate the guitar, you don't like the sound of it, right? That's one thing. But if you're having trouble with things like reading music, if you're having trouble hearing the differences between pitches and things like that, then it wouldn't make any sense to switch to the piano. It wouldn't be any easier than the guitar. So it's a matter of, are there really test-specific differences that matter, or are you simply struggling with GMAT and getting stuck? And I often find people in that situation. I'll even see people who are thinking of going to law school and they're stuck on the LSAT, and they think, well, maybe I should go to business school and take the GMAT. And I say, well, it's going to be a lot of the same struggles, somewhat different content, but a lot of the same ways of having to think, and a lot of the same time and stress management issues. And so there's a lot that these have in common, which means if you've studied for one, you're not starting over when you do the other. Just like someone who's learned the guitar might have an advantage in learning the piano, but you're not necessarily giving yourself any advantage in starting over either. So some things to think about. First off, you want to look at the schools you're specifically applying to and find out if they take the GRE. If they don't, your decision's clear, right? You have to take the GMAT. If the schools you're applying to take the GRE, then you also want to say, do they prefer the GMAT? If that's the case, you still might want to take the GMAT, although you certainly could take the GRE. Then the next thing would be, are there tracks that you want to get into later, such as banking and consulting? Although it's not a clear thing, it's not you must take the GMAT to become a banker or a consultant. We often find that there are programs that want GMAT scores. And even when you're out of business school or you're currently enrolled in business school, I see people doing this. I've also seen people retake the, people who had taken the GMAT, retake the GMAT to get a better score for such purposes. And so if that's the kind of thing you have in your mind, it might not make sense to take the GRE. The other thing, as I said, is if you've already put some time in on one or the other, and that's important to think about going forward. So if you're switching, you have to think about, are there things you have to learn from scratch, such as formats, data sufficiency versus quantitative comparison? I memorized all this vocabulary for nothing. Maybe now, you're a better reader for knowing those words, but it's not something that's going to get tested when you switch, say, from GRE to GMAT. The other thing is, you'll often find there's a bit of a dip. You won't immediately test at the same level. You can find this out easily by taking a practice test. And if you go to our website, manhattanprep.com, you can take a free GMAT practice test and you can take a free GRE. You can also download official prep software from the GMAT and GRE websites. That software is the most accurate kind of score you can get because it's made by the people who make the tests. It's tends to be very low on analytics, whereas our software, or pretty much any test prep company's software, is going to give you more information about how you did on the test in specific areas, break it down more for you, show your time usage, things like that. So many people earlier in their studies choose to go with a third party such as us, and later on, when they're closer to their tests, do the official ones. And definitely treat all practice tests as a semi-precious resource. Be careful not to waste them. Some people take the practice test or even the real test, they treat it like a slot machine. Like, if I just keep trying, maybe I'll get the score I want. That's, I think, a dangerous mistake. I'll even see students who max out their tests in a year. You know, you can only take the GMAT 5 times in a year. And so I'll see students who are having to, like I said earlier, switch because they've you know, taken the GMAT too many times, and that's just poor planning. You don't want to do that. So if you've already spent a lot of time on one of the tests, you generally only want to switch if there's something about that specific test that's really killing you that's different on the other, right? It's very different from, say, quitting a job because you don't like it and just taking another job that you're also not going to like. You know, I'm quitting my job because my boss keeps telling me what to do, or I don't want to work for this bank because I don't like handling money, and then you go work at another bank, right? But if there are specific things about that test that are especially hard for you, then it could be sensible to move on. Okay. Also, sometimes a fresh test is a way to avoid burnout. Just like a new job might not be that different from your old job, but you needed a fresh start. That's understandable, but you really want to think deeply about whether that's really necessary in your case. Okay. If you haven't already spent the time, then it makes sense to just look now and say, what am I good at? You can certainly take one of each practice test and compare. Again, the scores aren't directly comparable. They're not scored on the same scale, but you can look at the GMAT GRE conversion tool. You can Google GMAT GRE conversion. And then, you know, what kind of things, if you're very visual, if you like interpreting graphs, if you like, you know, breaking down geometry visually, you might find the GRE easier, although both of those things still happen on the GMAT. If you're more about number sense and figure out where things are going, oh, the numbers are trending this way, GMAT can be very nice. But again, those skills are tested in both cases. A couple things to think about at each test. If you're making the switch, or if you want to check it out, these are the high priority items for each test. So what's unique to GMAT? Data sufficiency and sentence correction, which is grammar. What's unique to GRE is quantitative comparisons, comparing the two columns, and the text completion and sentence equivalence questions, which are the vocab questions. For both, you want to get good at how you manage time. The timing's a bit different for both. You have a little less time per question on the GRE, but you often will find you don't need as much time per question as you will on the GMAT, so that the timing can actually be tougher on the GMAT for some people, but it's a challenge in both cases. The other thing that's different about the GMAT is integrated reasoning, and if you're just getting started, it's okay to skip that. Long term, I recommend including it in all your practice tests, but when you're just beginning, you could skip that when you're trying to see which overall score is going to be better for you. So then look at the two and say, all right, how am I doing in terms of starting point? Where am I going to reach a competitive score? It's a little bit hard to know what the target score is for GRE, because a lot of schools don't publish their GRE scores. And there are some pros and cons to that. The pro is that because they don't publish their scores, sometimes they can be a little more forgiving in letting someone in with a slightly lower GRE score if they like the rest of their application, because it doesn't reduce those numbers that they have to print in US News. The con is that it makes it a little harder to gauge whether you're at the point that you need or not. I have a GRE student right now who's kind of saying, well, I think I'm where I need to be for my schools, but I don't really know for sure. Whereas with GMAT, it's often a little more blunt. In fact, some schools will even accept people provisionally and say, hey, you need this GMAT score to get in. That could, in theory, happen with the GRE, but the score requirements are a little better known for GMAT. In terms of timeline, that's another thing to consider. So the rough idea, and we're going to do this in terms of US timelines. If you're applying to schools outside of the US, the deadlines might be very different. So this is an example. Most people are trying to apply in round 1 or round 2. Round 1 deadlines are in the fall. If you have several applications, you want to leave some time for that. So ideally, you'd plan to be done with that already. So if you're already applying round 1, hopefully you're already done with your GMAT. It would be pretty tough at this point to prepare for the GMAT and put your applications together. Round 2 is a legitimate round, and some people avoid round 2 unnecessarily. I'm no admissions consultant, but my understanding is that your chances of getting into round 2 are not significantly lower. Depending on the school and your needs, there might be a difference in, say, scholarship availability, but other than that, round 2 is fine. And I would certainly rather apply to a school round 2 with a strong application than apply round 1 with an application that might get me rejected by a school I really want to get into. Round 3 is a tough one. At that point, it may be that your role is already cast, so to speak. And I use that analogy because a lot of times business schools are sort of assembling a team that they might like, and so they might have enough of your type, so to speak, and that could be a problem. So round 3 is a bit more of a desperation round, although it certainly, you certainly can get in. But you want to leave time for your applications as much as possible. It's very tough to be studying for the GMAT and working on applications at the same time. Those will require quite a bit of your energy. And every application is different. You can't simply reuse the same essays. They'll notice when you're being too generic. I think given our format today, I'd rather skip over to questions and answers. So I'm going to skip the sample problems. Other things to talk about, sorry. You can take a practice exam, again, at our website, manhattanprep.com. You could sign up for a full GMAT or GRE practice test, including all sections if you like. You could do one of each if that works for you to get a sense of how to compare those exams. If you'd like to take one of our courses, we offer full courses for GMAT and GRE. We teach those in person. We teach those in some international locations, and we teach them online. So we'd love to have you. You could do a full live class, or you can do a self-study option, including things like interactive videos. One of the things I love also is that you can call our office and actually talk to a person. So if you have questions about any of this, our student services reps love to talk to you about all this stuff, and they're informed about things like making GMAT versus GRE decisions. So thanks very much. You can use this code here to get a discount on the course. I'd love to take your questions at this time. I also want to mention again the GMAT Club giveaway. If you like this and comment on the stream when it's over, you can get a chance to win a subscription to 10 GMAT Club tests. So with this, I'd love to open it up to any questions you have. Be happy to address any of them. Okay, I see a few coming in. If you have a 720 GMAT and a similar GRE score, which one is better reported? So you're saying you already have the scores you need on both tests. There certainly wouldn't be a harm in reporting both, but again, I think that would depend on the preferences of the school. If it's a school that prioritizes the GMAT, then it would make sense to go with the GMAT. But if you're in that situation, you're in a great situation, and I don't think it would do you any harm to report both scores unless one of the scores indicated some form of weakness. That'd be the other thing. Some people really prioritize a balanced score, and I think mostly that's a myth. You don't need to have, for instance, 80th percentile in both quant and verbal. In fact, that's very difficult to do these days because of the weighting of the quant versus verbal the way it is. But if one of your scores was very high despite a low subscore in one area, then it might make sense to report the more balanced score. How much on average do people prepare for the two tests? That's a really good question. That's going to depend from person to person for sure. Most people spend at least a few months. Obviously, there are some people who just go in and take it, and I don't meet those people, right? I feel like every one of my students seems to have a friend who says, oh, I just took a practice test and then went and took the real thing and I got a 750. And sometimes I think people underreport how much studying they do, and some people are just really good at tests and they can do that. Most people take at least a few months. It depends on where you want to go. For instance, if you're trying to get, say, from a low score, like a below 500 score, to a 700 plus score, that could take many months. Some people study for years. We try to avoid that. I think some people are falling off, but I have seen rare cases of very persistent students. I had one student who was an international student, learned English as an adult, and so had some fluency issues there. His initial score was a 300. He had taken the test 8 times over his course of 3 years and gotten his GMAT score from a 300 to 600. And although I worked with a student just once, I haven't found out where he went from there. His plan was to keep going until he got a 700, and I hope he made it. And given his persistence, he may well have. So that's obviously an extreme case. most people study for a few months, but I'll see students who are trying to get, again, from, say, like I had a student who got from 470 to 710, and he did that by spending a month with our Foundations of Math curriculum before taking our course, then taking our 9-week course, and then taking about a month and a month afterwards to month or month and a half to really cement things and kind of push a few things to the next level. So the other question was about GMAT being used for other industries such as consulting. My understanding is that no, typically those tracks are looking for GMAT. It's possible that in the future they'll look at GRE scores, but anecdotally, the last we've heard, no schools, no programs are saying, hey, give us your GMAT or GRE score. They're saying GMAT in particular. We also don't know of any programs that require that prefer GRE to GMAT, unless, again, you're doing some kind of dual program where GRE is required for one part of that dual program. Beyond that, I've yet to hear of a business school that says, hey, yeah, we prefer the GRE. That could happen over time if they think that certain things are more valid. But one thing that's interesting to know is the GMAT is actually owned by a group of business schools. So the business schools own the GMAT, and so they have a vested interest in it, and you know, they actually change it from time to time or add things to try to make it the premier business school test. For instance, integrated reasoning was added in 2012, in part, I think, as a competitive response to the GRE, to say, hey, this is a business school-like test, and the material in the GMAT IR might kind of remind you of business school type case studies. GMAT scores for MIM programs, are they published by the schools? Not that I know of, but honestly, that's not something I have expertise in, so I can't say for sure. But generally speaking, we're seeing the real pressure on GMAT scores is in you know, MBA programs. So you switched from GRE to GMAT because you found the verbal section tough. You'd have to compare how you do on the GMAT itself. The GMAT section is verbal section is very tough for non-native speakers, and in fact, GMAT Quant can be very tough for non-native speakers. I sometimes see people missing tons of verbal and then all the wordier word problems on GMAT because they find that it's simply hard to interpret what the question wants from them. So it would be certainly something worth checking out. If your main difficulty on the GRE were the vocabulary they were testing, you might find GMAT easier, but then you got to test grammar. And as if you check out the forums on GMAT Club, you can see that it's an endless struggle to master the intricacies of English grammar. And you literally, you could study it forever. I've grown up as a native speaker of English. My father is an English professor, and I majored in English myself. And I wouldn't say I'm close to mastering all of English grammar. In fact, there are probably many English grammar rules that some of my students know that I don't, simply because as a native speaker, I just talk and the words come out. And there are just endless rules we can memorize. Do you want to do all of that? No, but some of that has to happen for you to get to an acceptable level on the GMAT verbal. All right, folks, looks like that's all the questions. Thanks so much for coming, everybody. Again, I want to mention the GMAT Club giveaway, so like the video and post a comment afterwards. You can look at the description you've seen to get more details on the giveaway. Thanks, everyone, so much for joining us, and on behalf of all of Manhattan Prep, good luck on your GMAT or GRE or both. Hopefully not both. Thanks, everyone, for participating, and have a great rest of your day or evening or whatever time zone you're in. Thanks, all.